to me, as a sports fan and as a football fan, I followed this guy since I was a kid. And now I didn't get the chance to see him win his undefeated season with the Miami Dolphins, and that was in the late 70s. And he had an undefeated year. I think he won 17 games. 17 games?
14-0 in the regular season and then 3 playoff wins in 1972.
17-0, which he's the first head coach to ever have an undefeated NFL season. The Patriots were very, very close to doing that in 2007 before the Giants ruined that for him. And, of course, you're giggling and laughing because you're a Giant fan. But nevertheless, you didn't want to see – Don Shula did not want to see the New York Giants – I'm sorry, the New England Patriots have an undefeated season because now, even though he has passed away, he still can – go in the ground and die happy that he coached the only undefeated NFL team in NFL history.
And I think every year since then, in 1972, every living member of that team has celebrated every time that their record will stay cemented when the last undefeated team loses. And there's been some close calls. We saw the Patriots do it. We saw, the Panthers when they went to the Super Bowl that year. They were 14-0 at one point. The Bears in 85, I think their only loss was to the Dolphins that season when Shula was coaching, ironically. I think they were 12-0 or something like that. So there's been some close calls, but it's a great tradition they have. And again, rest in peace, Don Shula. You were easily one of the best coaches ever, maybe even the best coach ever.
Well, you can argue the point because there were a lot of great coaches, and I still think Vince Lombardi is the greatest coach of all time, even though his record doesn't show that. Vince Lombardi had probably one of the greatest tenures as a head coach in NFL history with the Green Bay Packers. But he won 5 championships. They weren't Super Bowls, right, but they were 5 championships, and he won 5 in a row. So it's completely different than a Super Bowl, obviously, a different name. But it's incredible when you think of this guy's career as a head coach and really as an NFL confidant. And what he has done for the NFL has been great and special, to say the least. When you look at his career, 2-time Super Bowl champion, 4-time AP NFL Coach of the Year in 1964, 1967, 68, and 72, Sports Illustrated Sportsman of the Year in 1993, NFL's 100th anniversary all-time team, a 1970s all-decade team, and the Miami Dolphins honor roll. So he's had an incredible career, but his record is what stands out to everybody. His record is what really puts him on top of the ballot of some of the top coaches of all time.
He coached 33 years, too.
347 wins, 173 losses, 6 ties. Postseason 19 and 17. It's not a great playoff record. Just like you look at Peyton Manning, everybody says, well, Peyton Manning wasn't a great quarterback. It wasn't a great NFL quarterback in the playoffs. But if you look at his regular season, he's one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play the game. But Peyton Manning still had a winning record before he retired. And the same thing with Don Shula. Now, they're 2 different positions, obviously a head coach and a quarterback. And you're talking about 2 of the best, biggest, faces in NFL history. Don Shula in the 60s, the 70s, and really the 80s was the face of head coaching. He really was.
And don't forget about the stint before he had Miami. He was with the Baltimore Colts for a while with that talented team. I don't know if he won a championship with them when they won in 58. I don't know if he was there at that time, but again, that was one of the most talented teams with Johnny Unitas, with Raymond Berry, a lot of talented players on that offense, and even on the defense too. That was a very good coaching tenure there too. And then with Miami, even just really the statement of the 70s, really, with all the great defensive players they had. They had Bob Greasy, a lot of good receivers. He coached some very good teams, and he was obviously a huge reason why.
Well, he was a huge reason why. And coaching in football is the number 1 position in all of sports, in my eyes. To coach a football team, you have to worry about special teams, defense, and obviously offense. And what he did for the Miami Dolphins, their culture as an organization in the late 70s and early 80s, he showed dominance. When you see what the New England Patriots of this era, that was what Miami was in the late 70s and early 80s. They were dominant. Great defenses, great offenses, great offensive lines, great quarterback. And even when he went with his undefeated season, he didn't even have a star quarterback playing the position. What this guy has done, not only for the league, he drove coaches like Bill Belichick, Bill Parcells, Gibbs, all the great coaches we talk about of our past and our present, these guys are trying to be just like Don Shula. Don Shula won 2 Super Bowls, and obviously we know how many Super Bowls Bill Belichick won. He won 6. But Super Bowls aren't everything when it comes to football and greatness. You have to have a great quarterback. You have to have a great team to win that many Super Bowls.
Mm-hmm. And especially in the 80s, too. People are going to criticize him for his postseasons with that, and they criticize Dan Marino, too, because of it. But those rosters that they had in the 80s were not as talented. It was really Shula's coaching that got them going, too, especially on the defensive side of the ball. It was really Dan Marino doing everything on the offense, and him and Shula just basically coaching the rest.
He's one of the greatest leaders in professional sports for men. Every story that I've heard about Don Shula, and my grandfather was a big Don Shula fan because he watched football religiously in the 70s and the 60s and the 50s. I really didn't get to see Don Shula coach because by the time I became a football fan in probably, I would say 1987, 88, when I was a kid, he was practically done with his career. I mean, his career, he was still coaching, but his career was practically over. He wasn't at the top of his game as a head coach. His last season was 1995.
He was 65 years old.
I started watching football in 87, 88. So I really just got to see Don Shula coach probably 7 years. And it wasn't at the top of his game.
Yeah, they were 6-10 in 1988, 8-8 in 1989. He had some good years after that, 12-4, 11-5, 10-6.
I remember the 12-4 season.
Yeah, so they definitely had some good years, but it was more.
They weren't expected to win Super Bowls.
They were.
Him and Dan Marino did go to a Super Bowl.
Right, and yeah, I think that was 85. They went to the Super Bowl, and then they also went in 83. They lost to the Redskins when John Riggins ran all over the Dolphins. But even in the 90s, when you look at it, considering how dominant Buffalo was in the AFC East at that time, having those kinds of records are still very impressive.
It's an impressive career, and you can go up and down his story. And if you guys you don't know who Don Shula is, go to Wikipedia. You can read all about this guy. This guy was his position as a player. He was a defensive back. Don Shula, as a player, he was a defensive back. He understood defense. His teams, his great teams, had dominant defensive teams. Mm-hmm. In the late 70s and early 80s, Don Shula had some of the greatest defensive teams we have seen in NFL history. Nobody talks about that because you think of the Bears. You think about the new and improved old Seattle Seahawks with the Legion of Boom, and then you talk about the Baltimore Ravens of the 2000 era, how dominant they were with Ray Lewis and Ed Reed, the great defenses they had. But nobody talks about Miami and how great those defenses were. Even at the end of his career with Zach Thomas and all the different defensive players, that Jason Taylor's. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He had Hall of Fame defensive players really every decade he coached.
Yeah, and again, it's just a great team defense. And again, in that era of football, you really needed that level of defense to win in order to win. And the Dolphins, like you were saying earlier, they weren't a high-end quarterback team. They weren't a high-end receiver team in the 70s. It was a running and defense team. It was Larry Csonka, Mercury Morris, and that great defense. And that really took them far, including, again, that undefeated season in 72.
It's an incredible career, and Don Shula will be missed in the NFL world. He'll be missed when you hear stories and you watch the NFL Network and they play old clips of the Miami Dolphins. And Don Shula was one of the cockiest head coaches of all time. He was a very cocky man. He had an ego trip, but the guy knew how to win. That was what he was. He was a winner. Bill Belichick, you say whatever you want about Bill Belichick. He was a winner. He is a winner. It's very hard to be consistent in the NFL as a head coach. Mm-hmm. And the years that he coached one team, as many years as he coached this one team, and he did. He was obviously the Baltimore Colts head coach from 1963 to 1969, and then in 1970 all the way to 95, which is almost 25 years, he was a head coach of the Miami Dolphins.
And in that stretch, it was only 1976 and 1988, the first year you were saying you watched football, those were the only 2 losing seasons he had in that entire tenure. Everything was either 8-8 or above, and most of them were double digits.
You have to look at his career, and again, you don't point fingers of what Miami is now because you can't blame Don Shula. He hasn't been a head coach since 1995, but Don Shula has been part of the Miami organization still to this day before he passed away. And so has Bill Parcells. Some of the greatest head coaches have been a part of this organization, at least for the last few decades. And the incredible thing, and shout out to Mark Everett, he's writing, Shula lost his last 5 road playoff games. Last playoff win or road was 1972 AFC Championship game in Pittsburgh, 1974 lost at Oakland, 1979 lost in Pittsburgh, 1990 lost at Buffalo, 1994 lost in San Diego, and 1995 lost at Buffalo. Nobody's saying that Shula was a great playoff coach because he wasn't. 19 and 17 is not a good record. But this guy won 2 Super Bowls, and he still coached one of the most dominant NFL teams, and some people say one of the top 3 NFL teams of all time.
And Mark, you also have to remember, too, that most of those teams that you listed, especially the Steelers in the 70s, were a lot more talented than what the Dolphins were overall. The Steelers roster was loaded. Buffalo, like we were saying, in the 90s was loaded at that time. So talent-wise, you wouldn't expect them to catch up and even compete at all. So, again, you got to give Shula a lot of credit for that, too. And again, a lot of those games were against great teams. It's not like they got upset badly by some 8-8 scrap heap team that made it in the playoffs. The Raiders were one of the most talented teams. They lost that game in that was the sea of hands, that weird catch.
I didn't grow up a Miami fan anyways. I'm a Jet fan and a diehard Jet fan. So one of the teams that I absolutely hated more than anything, more than life itself, the 2 teams in my division is the Miami Dolphins and the New England Patriots. I always hated both teams. It didn't matter who it was. I never hated Buffalo. I really never hated Buffalo.
That's weird because you started watching football when they got really good.
I didn't hate them.
That's weird.
I never hated Jim Kelly. I never hated Doug Flutie. I never hated any of the quarterbacks or the Buffalo Bills. Now, over the years, they have great teams, and we could talk about tons and tons of players that have been in and out of Buffalo. But the teams that I absolutely hated as a Jet fan were the Miami Dolphins and the New England Patriots of the time that I was really invested into watching football, and still am. The 2 teams I still can't stand in my division is Miami and the Patriots.
I think everybody hates the Patriots now.
Everybody, trust me, everybody in the AFC East that hates, that are Jet fans, they don't like Miami either. The Dolphins are a very hated team for Jet fans because for years they've come right under us and beat us in games that we should have won.
Well, it's also the impact of that draft too, the Jets passing on Dan Marino, and again the Dolphins stealing him right after. So
and the Jets
they're
will
still sour.
And the Jets will always be remembered as the team that passed on Dan Marino. But the Jets have passed on many, many different players, including quarterbacks. Tom Brady, everybody passed on for 6 rounds or 4 rounds.
The Chiefs took a quarterback too in the top 10 as well of that draft. I think it was Todd Blackledge. I think he went 9th overall, and they passed on Dan Marino. It was really only again the Bills with Kelly, and it was the Broncos with Elway, or the Colts.
Well, the Jets thought O'Brien was going to be a good coach in the league, and I mean, I'm sorry, good player in the league and coach, I guess. He never coached, but a lot of Jet fans thought that O'Brien was going to do the job, and he wasn't a bad quarterback. He just wasn't Dan Marino. Dan Marino, statistically, was one, if not the greatest, the 2nd or 3rd greatest quarterback to ever play the game.
You could argue the greatest pure passer, too, the way his skills were, especially like we talked about last week with Brett Favre, in an era of football where it was very defensive-oriented with the rules.
And one of the greatest coaches of all time is no question and no argument, Don Shula.